So I was going to say, it feels like we've known each other for a decade, but we actually have known each other for a decade.
Yeah, so it doesn't just feel, it's a reality.
And of all things, I tend to forget this because I think I'd rather forget it, but we met through Craigslist. You put an ad on Craigslist and I answered it, and I survived it.
Yeah, I was trying to learn Ruby on Rails like back in the day when it was a new thing, and was living in DC at the time, and while there was a lot of technology with the defense industry, I was very unsure if there's going to be anyone poking around with new technologies at the time.
And I answered, and I lived to tell the tale, and you went on to do a bunch of different things. You worked for tech companies, you built your own startup, you went through Techstars, built Visify, and ended up being acquired by Yahoo and went through that whole experience. And now you're working for the show at Silicon Valley, right? So when did you start working for them?
So I began working for them at the end of June, and in fact I decided to leave Yahoo. This was following the acquisition, so having done the startup story, and as it turned out they were looking for a replacement for what they call the lead technical advisor role. The short version of it, it's my job to help make sure that all the tech is true and accurate.
Right, and tech means more than just like a whiteboard detail or a code snippet, right? It's so pervasive in the world of the show that I've heard you talk about, like how you have to think about like does the company feel real? Are the motivations of the character that of a real person in a startup? And of course down to details of like making sure like technical words being used and technical snippets being used are very accurate.
Yeah, it's actually quite challenging, but it's really everything from high to low, and the little details are sort of the easiest pieces to get right. The harder thing is first and foremost, it's a show that's telling stories about people in a startup, and so we often start there. What would you be thinking about in this situation? What would you be doing? There's a lot of effort made by the writers who are tremendously talented to try and seize on, well, what are the emotionally salient things that would be going on? What are the characters' motivations? How would that all be put together?
Right.
And so we often start there.
Right, and I have friends in Silicon Valley, the place, that always comment on the show being like very technically accurate. But I think what they usually mean is it's very emotionally accurate. It reminds them of their own struggle, their own battle, their own motivation and reaction to things. And I think it's funny how the show sometimes gets credit for getting the small technical details right when the writing has been like just really stellar throughout the seasons.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing that's most impressed me about the writers. I mean they're such great natural storytellers, but really seizing on, we'll hear an interesting anecdote or I'll tell them about an experience and they'll be like, oh, what you mean by that, or what the most interesting aspect of it is. You're like, yeah, you're right. And it's rarely a technical detail. That's kind of the icing on the cake, but right. It's much more often what you were going through when you're experiencing
So has it taught you a lot, and kind of how you think about Silicon Valley now? You look at Silicon Valley, because now you've been working out of LA for a little bit, and you go back to SF every now and then. Do you look at it differently?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. As you know, it's very much its own hothouse bubble, so you go away and you come back and you have a unique perspective on it. I had the pleasure of going back with the writing team, and so getting to see their reaction. They've been going every year on a field trip, and we meet a lot of people sort of up and down the value chain. One of the most interesting things to me is how much sort of the core of the Valley still has this almost chip on its shoulder, that it's like small, that it's fighting giants. But in fact, technology has become 40% of our economy. And I think the writers are very aware of sort of this dichotomy sometimes between, what people say or how they think about themselves and sort of the actual numbers and influence that technology wields.
Right. There must be a lot of comedy to mine from that, right? It's like a big dog thinking it's small, or a small dog thinking it's really, really big. It's just that contrast is kind of striking. But so how does the show get written? I mean, it seems like it's only on the air for like 10 weeks a year, right? But it's a big effort that involves like hundreds of people.
Yeah. So it's actually an incredibly overwhelming effort when you see it in practice, and it's kind of daunting. It's been one of the most fascinating things working on it. But it really has sort of three components. So there are 10 episodes, and it takes a good 8 to 10 months to really go from beginning to end of the process. But the first third is writing, and so I'll sit with the writers in the writer's room, and it's really just breaking story, and you talk about narrative arcs, and those become outlines, and the outlines become paper outlines, the paper outlines become scripts, and then the scripts over time become shooting scripts. But aside from this writing process, which is really getting the details right, figuring out how to get the characters from A to B, then you roll into the actual production, which is the filming, and that, as you might imagine, is a wild, crazy thing itself.
So I was surprised, right? Because the taping seems like it takes maybe like 4 months from what you told me before, and then the writing ahead of that takes another 4 months, right?
It does, and then there's another 4-ish months of post-production too. As you can imagine, there's a lot of they often shoot extra tape, so they have to cut things back. There are small adjustments that need to be made, and there is some VFX. So some of the tech stuff that they show, they may film actual code on a monitor, but in many cases that stuff actually gets green screened on after the fact. So.
Still, a lot of the show, it seems like, is, I mean, I was surprised. The set, I went and took a tour of it, but the set is actually like a house, and you can go from room to room, and the computers are all there the way that you see them on the show, and so much of it is actually like, feels like really being in Palo Alto, really being in one of those houses we've all been in, but it's constructed as a kind of continuous kind of set and continuous element.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see how the structure itself is designed in such a way that you can get cameras and lights where you need them to. But in fact, it's actually based off of a real Palo Alto house.
Right.
So it's quite accurate. And, with the quality of cameras and everything else today, it's amazing. There's a construction team who's essentially building on a soundstage, more or less a real house, which is where the shooting takes place.
Yeah, and it's just, as you were observing, I think earlier, it just heightened, right? The house is real, but just a little bit more so than a real house. And just like, a lot of the characters and situations, of course, they're not like exactly real, but they're grounded, right, in that emotional core of what you're doing as a startup.
Yeah, and in some senses, like any novel, just has the good bits in it. We hear really interesting stories. People are sometimes a little bit more open talking to us since we're not technically in the Valley now, and as a result of it, in some senses, you hear the best anecdotes, and we're able to kind of cherry pick, because no real startup would encounter everything that Richard and the guys have encountered. But where we try to be true is everything they encounter has happened to someone. we know. So.
And then that must be nice. And you said the good bits, but in fact, it is a lot of the bad bits that sometimes you don't hear about, Silicon Valley, because the press and investors and just the general structure of Silicon Valley as a place seems to really encourage you to kind of promote yourself and only talk about the right things, and having your startup always being so great and on such a crushing it, right? And so it seems like interesting that you guys are able to get the peek at the other stuff that happen all the time, which is like the failures and the mistakes and the egos and everything else.
Yeah, no one likes to talk about it in the Valley, or it's not talked about enough. But I mean, still the reality for most startups is failure at the end of the day, and I think the writers are sort of keenly aware of that and really love that. I mean, there are real stakes here. Like, it's not a fait accompli that you're going to make it.
Right.
So.
And so it feels like from the outside that maybe like the essential balance of the show is kind of negotiating kind of this need for narrative arc and something that's very engaging to viewer, but also remaining technically accurate. Do you find those to actually be at odds, working on the show, or are they not?
It's a bit of a push and pull, but the writing process, like coding, is actually so iterative, and so sometimes you'll actually start with an anecdote or a story or an experience and work backwards to try and say, okay, what's the emotional arc? Sometimes, in fact, a character is located at a certain point, there's a story they want to tell, and then you need to think through how technology can play a role. And sometimes you go back and forth and you realize this is a dead end, or we're going to end up with 15 minutes of Richard coding on screen, which is not an interesting thing to go ahead and see. So it's a push-pull process. I guess I'm a little bit more I guess forgiving or used to that process, just having been in tech, which is a process of iteration, and I actually began my career in publishing. So it's sort of this process of breaking and re-breaking and going over it again and trying to make it better, faster, stronger. Is something I'm kind of used to.